Alright guys, welcome back. We are into the second section of our World War II unit, Unit 8. And today we're going to focus on what we're going to call Hitler's Lightning War. Now this is a really big topic, so we're only going to cover about half of this today. So we're going to split this big topic into two separate videos because it's just too much to do all in one. It would be a little overwhelming. But now we're ready to finally get World War II going officially. So let's get into some of those details and figure out how the war started and then why Hitler was so successful early in the war. And the key is his new tactic, something called blitzkrieg, which we'll talk all about in a few minutes. Alright, so before we get into the details, let's first look at a map of what's going on in the first 3 years of the war. So 1939 and 1942, and yep, Germany is attacking, like, everywhere, right? I mean, you can see Germany is going on this massive invasion spree all across Europe. And that tells us Hitler was very powerful early in the war. And let's get into some strategy now. Again, it's called blitzkrieg. So the war begins in September of 1939. Recall that after World War I, Germany, which is here and here, was divided by Poland. Poland was given this little bit of land right here to give access to the sea, and that basically cut this part of Germany off, this part of Germany off from this part of Germany by turning this had been German land into Polish land. And Hitler says to Poland, give me this land or else. And this is something he had said about Czechoslovakia, if you recall. And Poland refuses. And when Poland refuses, Hitler says, well, fine, I'm going to invade you. And so he does, with a massive military invasion of some 2,400 tanks, 2,300 airplanes, 1.5 million soldiers. It was just an overwhelming assault on Poland. And this is what causes, something back here, this is what's going to cause Britain and France to declare war on Germany, is his invasion of Poland. Now, Hitler is successful in this attack not just because of overwhelming numbers, it's also new tactics, this thing called blitzkrieg, which translates literally as lightning war. And what lightning war or blitzkrieg is this overwhelming, rapid attack with fast airplanes and tanks. Your goal is to break through the enemy. Okay, so you can see step one, you're going to attack. So rather than putting all of your forces in one even amount here to oppose the enemy, you put your forces in these points of attack. So you put most of your forces here and here, and then they launch these penetrative attacks through the enemy to break through and encircle, cut off, and kill the enemy. That's what they're doing. So if you know anything about football, guys, you've heard of a blitz, right, where you're trying to get through the line, to get behind the line and get to the quarterback. That is what's happening. That's why the blitz is known as the blitz, is because, again, blitzkrieg means lightning war. All about speed, right? You've got to move super quickly. Don't give the enemy a chance to recover. Now, a key ingredient in all this is Hitler's Luftwaffe, or Air Force. And Hitler's Air Force was one of the best, if not the best, in the world at this time, in the very beginning of the war. They're going to be used to bomb cities, to bomb factories, to bomb targets on the battlefield. They're devastating. Now remember, Germany had repeatedly expanded and broken its promises, and Hitler had been able to get away with this because Britain and France had pursued the policy of appeasement. But now, Britain and France realize, much too late, that appeasement has not worked, and so they declare war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. But they're way far away from Poland, and Poland is on its own. And it fights hard, but it has to surrender in just about 3 weeks. It's overwhelmed by the Nazis. Here are Nazi soldiers marching through Warsaw, the capital of Poland, and the reaction of the Polish citizens. They're shocked and saddened and just confused by all this. Now remember, Poland had been secretly divided up between the Nazis over here in Germany and the Soviet Union, right? That was the agreement. So at the same time that Hitler was invading the Soviet Union from the west, invading Poland rather from the west, the Soviet Union is attacking Poland from the east. And basically the two sides carve up and divide up Poland. All right, let's get into main idea number 2 now. So Hitler is going to now turn his attention westward and northward. So war in the west. Let's get this done, guys. On April 9th, 1940, Hitler launches surprise attacks on Norway and Denmark. Okay, there's Denmark just to his north. Denmark fights back for all of about 4 hours before surrendering. Norway will last a little bit longer because it's further away. But nonetheless, Norway also surrenders within about 2 months. So if you're keeping count at this point, Hitler's taken over Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, and Norway. He looks pretty much unstoppable. But what about France? France is the tough country, right? An equal of Germany in many ways. So what happens there? Now, before we get to that, actually, let's talk about leadership change back in Britain. So when Britain failed to hold on to Norway and all these other countries, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the guy who had assured us that the Munich Agreement had been peace in our time, he resigns. And we have a new Prime Minister in charge of Great Britain. His name is Winston Churchill, and he's a favorite of mine, a really interesting character, and we're going to talk a lot about him as we go forward. And by the way, this is not the peace symbol, guys. This is V for victory. Now remember, we learned in our last unit that France, actually 2 units ago, France had been sort of preparing for a potential attack from Germany, if you recall, and that line of fortifications was known as the Maginot Line, right? And Hitler decides, well, why attack the Maginot Line when I can simply go around most of it by going through the Netherlands, that's Holland, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So you've got this massive sweep of German forces going this way, okay, and avoiding the teeth of the French defenses on the Maginot Line. And by the end of May of 1940, basically you've got this huge Allied army trapped on the coast at a place called Dunkirk. So again, the Germans had swept in, and this huge Allied army, French and British soldiers primarily, and some Belgians and Dutch soldiers, they're trapped. And they looked like they might be captured, and hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers would fall into German hands. But that's not to be. Okay, Hitler decides to basically pull back a little bit. He was fearful that that his armies had traveled too quickly and their supply lines were too far stretched, and so he calls a halt to the ground attack, and he relies on his air force to eliminate the trapped allies. But that is not going to help his cause, because the German air forces, they're not capable of doing this, and as a result, hundreds of thousands of British and French and Dutch and Belgian soldiers are rescued and ferried back to England. And so they survive to fight another day. But that's off in the future. And in the here and now, the evacuation of the Allies from Dunkirk really gives Hitler a free hand. And so his armies sweep southward, and on June 14th, 1940, Paris falls to Nazi forces. Now, think back to World War I. The Germans had attacked France for 4 years, not able to get to Paris, right? And Hitler's able to get to Paris in about 6 weeks. So this was a shock to the system, not just across Europe, but across the world. Hitler does go to Paris one time to do a little victory lap and kind of see the sights. There he is. We saw this picture very early this year. He was going to pay respects to another famous conqueror from history, Napoleon Bonaparte. On June 22nd, 1940, Germany surrenders, and that is it. France has surrendered, and they're out of the war. Again, this was absolutely shocking. Now, what to do with France? That was the big question. And to understand what happens to France, we need to remember or review what a puppet state is. And a puppet state is basically a country that's being controlled by an outside power. They're the puppet, and then another country is the puppeteer. And what's going to happen is that the northern third or so of France will be occupied by the Germans, okay, permanently. And Paris in particular, occupied by the Germans. The southern two-thirds of France, however, will be this puppet state called Vichy France, named for the city its government met in, Vichy, led by a World War I hero, Philippe Pétain. Now, again, officially, this government was totally independent, but the reality is they have to do whatever the Nazis tell them to do. So it's a French puppet. Not all French agreed with this. There are quite a few French who said we should keep up the fight. And in fact, a general who had escaped to England, Charles de Gaulle, this French general, urged his people to rise up and continue to resist Hitler. His movement was known as Free France because they're trying to free France from Nazi control. So think about Hitler's attack on Britain and why it would be different from his other blitzkrieg invasions, right? So Hitler's taken over Belgium, Netherlands, France, Norway, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland. This one's different, though, because of this, right? It's an island, and that makes all the difference. That narrow channel, the English Channel, is enough to keep Britain safe, in theory, right? See, Nazi leadership here peering across the English Channel. They can see the white cliffs of Dover, so they're in France, that's Britain, but that water might as well be 1,000 miles wide because the British had the best navy in the world. If somehow, some way, the Germans were able to make it to Britain, Britain is not going to just cave in like the French had. Winston Churchill famously said that we shall defend our island whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. This brings us to the Battle of Britain. And the Battle of Britain is unusual in that it's a war not on land or at sea, but totally in the air. And the first goal here is for Hitler's Luftwaffe, remember his Air Force, to destroy the British Navy and their Air Force. So if you take out their Air Force by using your Air Force, then you can use your Air Force to sink their Navy, and once that's out of the way, then the Germans can invade. And their plan was called Operation Sea Lion. They were going to come across the English Channel and invade. Let's see how that works. So in the summer of 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, begins bombing British airplane factories, airfields, and they're doing a really good job. They are really hammering the British Air Force, and it looks like Britain might become just the next country to fall to Germany. But by September of 1940, Nazi planes begin shifting their focus. Hitler decides that targeting British cities will be a better strategy. The theory was if you bomb the cities and thus kill civilians, that it will break British morale, and then they will simply put pressure on their government to surrender to end the bombing. And this is known as the Blitz. So the Blitz is that phase where the Germans were coming in and hitting cities left and right, and civilians, of course, are getting caught in the crossfire. And this is these are serious, deadly attacks on London and other major cities. I mean, that's how big that bomb must have been. Londoners are taking to the subway to find shelter. Kids are being evacuated out of the range of the bombers to the northern part of England. Even Churchill here is getting ready for the next air raid. But it turns out that this shift in policy of going after the cities and not the airfields and aircraft factories is going to backfire, because the Royal Air Force, or RAF, is given a chance to kind of recover. They're able to hold their ground. They also have a great technological advantage in that they have radar, so they can basically detect the German planes as they approach Britain, so they know exactly where their planes should be ready to go to pounce on German incoming bombers. And in the end, German losses began to pile up, and Hitler, in frustration, calls an end to the invasion. So the invasion is called off. The Battle of Britain has saved Britain, but some 40,000 British civilians died from German bombs in the process. But again, Britain would stand tall and defend against a German attack. Alright guys, we covered a lot of ground in this last video, and that's it for the first part of Hitler's Lightning War. In the second half of this video, we're going to cover Hitler reaching his high point, and then we're going to put some big obstacles in his way, and you put him on the path to failure. That'll be in the next video.